Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Scott Stedman podcast. Hope you are having a good day. Last week we have dropped our 250th episode. So again, thank you to all our listeners who have stuck with us, who've listened to us, who actually like the content we're putting out. We definitely appreciate each and every one of you. And if you're someone who's in a position where you like to help support financially this podcast, there's a link within the description that you can click on to support financially if you like to. But joining me today is my co-host, Micah Current. Out of the 250 episodes, Micah, I think you've been on like at least over 100 of them. So,
A lot of episodes.
yeah, yeah, I have to really go back and figure out, okay, what episode? Because I know you started right when I finished up the deconstruction series in 2000, 2001. So when I kind of was doing that, and
In
then you kind of jumped
2001,
on. Oh my gosh, 2021. Oh, I-
that was a
I'm
long
I'm
time
I'm
ago.
I'm going, man. I'm going back in time. We've been doing podcasting before podcasting ever existed. How's that for a story? It's gone wild. Time traveling Scott Stedman podcast. The first and only
Hmm.
podcast you should listen to.
No, I think that's, yeah, we'd be doing like AM radio or something.
Oh no. Oh goodness. Oh wow. I don't know.
I don't,
That just
I don't
deflated
even
me. AM
remember,
radio.
I don't even remember 2001.
I do. It was the year I graduated high school. It was the year I graduated high school. Yeah, which
S-
means
s-
which means next year I'll be doing my 25th high school reunion.
How does that feel?
I don't know. I went to my 20th one and it felt pretty good. I had a lot of good time at my 20th reunion. It was very well, not very few people were there, but it was a good time. So who knows? Like, I mean, I feel like in that aspect of the 20th that you had people who either I mean, I think about like my parents' generation and like my generation, and it just seemed like, my parents' generation probably when they went to their fifth or 10th high school reunion, everybody was married, everybody had kids, everybody was starting their careers. Where it seemed like when I went to my 5 year reunion, everybody was just getting out of college. Everyone was going back to school to get their masters. It seemed like everybody had accelerated plans. Uh, Either some people just got married, so they didn't marry like their high school sweetheart. Some people either just got married, some people, but I didn't know too many people that had kids 5 years after graduation. So then, like, even now, like, when I went to my 20th, like, someone recently got married. Since then, he's had his first kid. Um, there's a couple people who are advancing their careers still, like they're going to get their master's or their doctorate.
Sounds like
Some of
me.
some of them even just got married. Like, some of them even just like we're still dating someone and have never been married. We're kind of dating someone, like was dating someone consistently. You're probably going to get married sometime in the next year or so. So I thought that was very interesting. And then there's some people who had like three kids, or they have kids that are in high school now, or kids that are. But I don't think there was anybody who actually had kids that were going off to college. Like everybody still had kids that were either in elementary school or either junior high or high school. So it was kind of it was very interesting where, I'm sure like at my parents' 20th reunion, oh yeah, our kids are like our sons graduated high school, or that sort of thing. So it's just a different with generations and time and how people view marriage and family planning and all that jazz and career. Like it's just different than it was, when my parents were graduating high school, which would have been sometime in the I'd say sometime in the 80s. or maybe 70, 78, 79 is when they graduated. So I don't know.
My high school has never had a reunion.
That's interesting.
Yeah. I think they're going to try to do one this year, which would be our 20th.
Yeah.
But
Well,
I
yeah.
have no, there's been no like, I don't know if it's just lack of wanting to or just somebody would kind of take the reins of doing it.
Well, I know. I mean, I think it depends. I think like the way Talmadge did it is, I mean, we have an alumni society, like an overarching alumni society for our school. But then we also have like, it's usually the class officers. So whoever was the president, vice president, treasurer, secretary of my graduating class, like they're kind of the ones who are trying to, who are supposed to get the ball rolling. And if they can't get it done, if like no one's like, hey, I live in like Washington, D.C. or I live in California, I can't do it. Like, they'll try to put it off as like, hey, you guys want to do something? I mean, I think that's always the thing too. Like, do you want to do something small or do you want to do something big? I mean, my 5 year one, it was pretty small. It was more of like, hey, we're just going to meet at this restaurant where we have like it's $5, and then for like hors d'oeuvres, and then if you want to buy your drinks, you have to do that on your own. And we're just kind of hanging out. We didn't do like a special thing like, all right, any guesses on who was the most talkative in our grade? Like going back to the yearbook, like nothing like that. It was just like, hey, we're just gonna hang out and chill, like very simple. But I know it probably costs money to do all that stuff and to do it depending on how big or how small you want to do it. So yeah.
Yeah, I think they're going to try to do one this year, like I said, but honestly, I don't know.
Mm.
I mean, I would go, I think, just to see people. They're like, I think it's crazy when you graduate high school. Some people don't ever see anybody again. You
Oh
never
yeah.
see those people again. Like you graduate, you go your own way, and then never see them again,
Mm-hmm.
which
Yeah.
is people don't, you know, I don't know. I think it's different because I grew up in a pastor's home, and so like we moved a lot. So there was, um, great example of that is that the town that I live in now, like a lot of people go to high school or they grow up here, they go to high school here, they graduate from high school here, they go to college, they come back here, they live here, they start their families here, and they never
Mm-hmm.
leave. And so like I don't know what that looks like because
Oh
it's never
yeah.
been that's never been my way of life. So um yeah, it's fascinating.
It is. It is. Yeah, that is interesting. Before we dive into our topic today, stories gone wild. I'll go first because, I find it fascinating that, well, let me go back. So yesterday at church, I had one of my students who was helping me with Sunday school, and we're sitting there and we're talking, and I had music playing, and he's actually interested in music production. So it's funny because my son was talking about, Dad, this song is so boring. Like, why is it so slow? And I'm like, well, you have to wait for it to build. Like, there's a swell. And he's like, oh, what does that mean? I'm like, oh, well, so, we're playing music. So I'm like, here, let me play this song. And we're listening to different elements like verse, bridge, interlude, all that stuff. And it seemed like probably within the last, oh, geez, I want to say probably the last 5 years, it seemed like a lot of worship music is 6, 7, 8 minutes long. And usually they have like a build section in the song where they'll sing the chorus, and after the chorus, like everything kind of drops out, and then the vocals like repeating like the same phrase or something, and then the music will slowly start to come in, and it will build and build and build. It'll get to this point where they'll sing the chorus, and then they have this big triumphant boom, and then everything kind of fades out, and then that's it. So we were talking about, so as we were talking about, I'm like, well, each genre always has a different way of how they put music together. So we were talking about that, and I was playing a bunch of other random stuff just to get him. And she's like, "Oh, this is fascinating. Like, I'm very interested in production and how they put songs together and how why they do it in certain ways." I go, "Yeah, it kind of focused on that." So it was really cool. But then it also made me think about just the controversy. Um, what was it like earlier this week where Maverick City Music got into some controversy because they're featured on an album with Glorilla.
I don't even know who that is.
So Glorilla is a Tennessee-based hip hop artist, female, and her newer album came out, and every single song is explicit.
Okay.
Every single song is explicit, except for that one that not only features Maverick City Music, but also features Kurt Franklin. And it's actually interesting because if you actually pull it up on Spotify and you look through the track listing, every single song has E, but then there's that one song that has Maverick City Music that has no E. It's like non-explicit song. But then the song right after it, I don't know if it's a song or if it's like one of those like interlude things where it says Glow's Prayer. And even Glow's Prayer has an explicit tag on it too. And I'm like, I haven't listened to it, but that's been bringing a lot of controversy with Maverick City Music because a lot of people like their music, especially in worship. It's like, why are they being featured on this explicit hip hop artist's album? Um, which is fascinating, which I think is sometimes fascinating. It was the same thing when Lecrae was getting blasted because he had his Church Clothes album, and yet Chance the Rapper would be on it, or Kendrick Lamar would be on the album, and you're like, wait, why are you having these people on your album that are not in the Christian universe? You know what I mean? So I just
The
thought that was
universe.
weird. The Christian universe, like, woo. So, um,
As if it were like the multiverse or something.
yeah, there's this world, and then we go to the multiverse where there's the world of Jesus. And then there's the world of Ned Flanders. No, I'm joking. Yeah, but I find it very fascinating. And it's funny because there's a lot of people who are against this. There's a lot of people who are for it because they're thinking, like, hey, if Maverick City Music is about, hey, minister, this is an opportunity for them to minister to Glorilla. Like, so if they're being featured on her album, what type of stuff backstage are they doing where they're kind of ministering to her, even though her album's coming out and it's all like explicit stuff except for that one song. And I don't know. It's one of those things where it's very interesting how people react to when there is a even though I feel like that the whole like secular and sacred music of like the 90s where all that was kind of like in separate things, I feel like more and more now we're seeing more kind of that blending, like even with For King and Country when they had that song God Only Knows, and they had like a Timberland was on that. They did a remake of that song with Timberland, and then they did a remake of that song with Dolly Parton. Like there's kind of almost like that bridge between those two musical worlds, I guess. I know I'm talking like it's a multiverse of everything, but I think it's surprising that
Genre, yes.
genres, um,
Not multiverse.
multiverses, the genres. So I don't know. It's one of those things where it's very interesting to see like how this is going to help or hurt them. I know Maverick City's playing in Columbus November 12th. Um, so we'll see. Like, are there going to be people protesting Maverick City music? Like they used to protest Marilyn Manson concerts back in the day.
I'll
What
tell
what
you.
about what about
I'll
you,
tell you.
Mike?
I'll tell you the one time I saw Marilyn Manson, but we can't say it on the Scott Tillman podcast what he did. So
Oh
we we
no.
might get an E next to your episode. So um,
Oh my goodness. Well, actually I put that on there, so if I don't put
do
it
you,
on there,
do you remember Ozfest?
I do remember Ozfest, yes.
Yeah. So that's all you need to know. Um,
Okay. All right.
um, actually, I have two stories
Okay, go ahead.
since you brought up music. Um, so this weekend, Alicia's grandma came to visit. and it was she's the last of the three grandmas that are living that haven't met um, my kid, my daughter,
Mhm.
and her aunt Diane and Uncle Dave came, but they were going to go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Okay.
So this past weekend, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame happened up in Cleveland. By the way, there was a ton of stuff happening in Cleveland this weekend. The Cleveland
Oh yeah.
Guardians game with the Yankees, game five of that series. The Browns played yesterday. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame this weekend. It was crazy. I didn't want to be anywhere near Cleveland. But anyway, so Dave and Diane came on Friday with Grandma Mary, and they visited with us Friday. They got up early Saturday and drove to Cleveland and left Mary at my in-laws' house, Grandma Mary at my in-laws' house to hang out with us, hang out with the baby, etc. They have a giant black SUV. And so ahead of time, they drove this or they're driving this SUV, but ahead of time they purchased a parking permit for this Hall of Fame ceremony. And so they get in line, and this parking permit goes into this garage next to the arena or the Hall of Fame arena, and their SUV is too big to get into the parking garage. And so they have to back out in the middle of traffic to to get out of line because they can't park there.
Hmm.
Meanwhile, people think it's a celebrity because the windows are tinted. It's a black SUV, and they were like, "Dr. Dre, Dr." Somebody like heard that it was Dr. Dre, and so they were like yelling at my wife's aunt and uncle, "Dr. Dre, can we get your autograph? Where's Dr. Dre?" Like they were just screaming and carrying on, and her uncle Dave rolls the window down. He's like, "I don't know who you're looking for, but he ain't in here." And they ended up having to go find another parking spot. That's one story. Second story is that yesterday at church we started a new series called Habits,
Hmm.
and Pastor Mike is going through and talking about certain habits that we all have habits, and um, some are good, some are bad. And he brought up the conversation about how sometimes in church we all sit in the same space and we don't ever move from that space. Which Alicia and I are pretty intentional about sitting somewhere different every week. We just always have. And part of that is due to being on staff at churches, and you just kind of sneak in after worship and go around and find a seat that's available. Uh, or you're going to go work in the sound booth or the tech booth or whatever. Um,
Hmm.
and when Pastor Mike mentioned, some of you are all laughing because you're sitting in the same pews, Alicia kind of like nudges me on the elbow, and she points over to the left, and there's this old man with his arms crossed and his head down in his chest out. He's sleeping in the middle of the service. Like he is out cold. And I'm like, well, there's that guy. He's got to have it.
Oh wow.
And Alicia just laughed. And we're like, meanwhile, our kid's trying to like talk because she's starting to find her voice. And it's like, oh, these old people, um, they come to church to sleep. And,
Well,
and I was like, man, he's probably been up since like 4 a.m. and he went to McDonald's at 5 to get his cup of coffee. And now he's taking a nap.
I mean, I wouldn't put that. I wouldn't put that behind them. Like it's it's interesting. I mean, I don't know. I feel like that's a cultural thing too. Like, and I don't know if it's because those guys used to have to get up super early to go to
Yeah, for
work.
work. Yeah.
And like I knew one guy, he would always get up early. He'd always get his coffee at like, whenever McDonald's or Bojangles would open, which would be like maybe 5:30, 6 o'clock. And I'm thinking, oh, because he would have to get up early, shower, and then he would work because he worked for the city. So he would always be in a city vehicle, working, do all this stuff all the time. I'm thinking, holy cow, that's crazy. So,
Yeah. My grandma used to do that when she used to work in the factory.
hmm.
She used to get up at like 5 a.m. and leave every day. And she'd go to bed at like 8 or 9 at night. But then Well, my grandfather was still alive. He would do that. They would do that on Mondays, even after they retired. Every Monday they would go to McDonald's at like 5 or 6 in the morning and sit there for 4 hours and drink coffee.
Hmm.
It's like you're going to put McDonald's out of business.
Yeah.
Probably not because they probably make a killing anyway.
Yeah, true. Oh, goodness. Goodness,
So we,
goodness, goodness.
so what are we talking about today?
You tell me what we're talking about today. So, Micah,
It's your,
you sent me
it's
a
your
video.
podcast.
I know, but you're the one who sent me the video. Go, we should talk about this. And it's a video that you thought we were going to talk about last week, and we weren't. And you go, oh, I was not prepared for this.
Yeah, well,
So now you're prepared. So there's a video you sent me
honest
on.
to God, I forgot I had sent the first one.
So what we're talking about today, because I know Micah, ever since fall of last year when we started talking with Karma and Nick about the affirm stuff, and even just like when we were discussing that interview with the Church of the Nazarene and Dr. Thomas Ord and all his stuff on his stance with the LGBTQ community and the church and kind of that either you want to call it a connection or disconnection. Um, but there, you sent me this video from a community Bible church, and they had this message where they were talking a little bit about what they believe as a church, who should, the type of people that they, not necessarily the type of people they want in a church, but the type of people they minister to the church. And one of the things they talked about is they talked about extensively a little bit 3 points on how churches respond to the LGBTQ community. And I thought it was a very interesting take that this pastor kind of did to, I think from him, how he explained the different church models of how they welcome or unwelcome the LGBTQ community within their church culture. And also, kind of in his way, he also kind of gave a little bit of a definition on what affirming means to him or how he defines affirming, which I think's been kind of the always been the question for us is what do you mean by affirming? Because we may think it's this, but just from our conversations, it seems like it may be a little bit more than what we think or a little bit less. So we really don't know what some people we've interviewed, what they actually mean by affirming. Um, but this guy kind of breaks it down. I thought it was a very interesting video you sent me. Um, so just to kind of start it off, like when you first watched that video, what were kind of your thoughts about it? What was some of your reactions to it?
Well, I think that, we try to be a little bit more, bias and respect to the topics that we cover, and we don't want to like sway the listeners one way or another, I guess, but we're not journalists at the same time. So like we just record about stuff that we hear and see and are passionate about. And I think you're right. Although we had the Child Affirm folks on and we've had them on, didn't we have them on twice?
We only had them on once. Like we talked about it, and then they
Okay.
reached out for
Yeah.
us to.
So anyway, we had them on once, and then um, we talked about the other, conversation with Pastor Tom. Is it Tom Ward or who's the guy that we just talked about a couple weeks ago? The
Thomas
Nazarene
Ord.
guy,
Thomas
Ward.
Ord.
Yeah, it was Tom. I just didn't know his last name. Um, but the conversation about having, with that particular topic of him, having theological reasons as to why he believes what he believes, and you know, we've talked about different things, whether it's a TikTok video or social media posts or the Church of God this or the Church of God that. Even the UNC for that matter, splitting and the Presbyterian Church splitting recently over this very issue. And, you know, back to the conversation of being biased or not, to me, this guy's interpretation of how the church should respond to this conversation is probably the most accurate thing that I've seen.
Mm.
And the reason I say that is one, he goes through and says, you know, you're welcome here, and there's a place for you here. And two, you know, he talks about the world's view of affirming LGBTQ, which is, in his definition, taking stuff out of context, out of scripture, and being of the world and living in sin, which I wholeheartedly agree with. Um, and thirdly, the idea of, you know, we're going to try to work with you, work alongside you, and bring you in. You know, they're all points in which I agree with because, and it's just where I align with things. Spiritually, you know, theologically, personal beliefs, etc. Um, but I think, you know, another thing I wanted to say is that I think that he did a good job of saying things that I think a lot of pastors want to say without getting in trouble, if that makes sense.
I I think I know where you're going with, but can you expound that a little bit further in case someone from our audience doesn't know what you mean by not get in trouble?
Well, like not getting backlash from their board, not getting backlash from their
Mm.
congregation, not having protests, not living in fear of losing their job, you know, XYZ. And you and I both have worked in Church of God's, Church of God congregations, and some, are healthier than others. And the idea of, you're not going to be able to say something without, having a board meeting the next day in your office, asking for your resignation letter because you disagree with, or somebody disagrees with something you've done. Um, there could be a lot of backlash that goes along with
Yeah.
that. Especially when you hit such a hot button topic like what we're talking about today, and the same thing could go for things like, I don't know,
Hmm.
political things. We're getting ready to have an election in a couple of weeks. Like
Yeah.
political things, LGBTQ things, embezzlement, uh, you name it. All the things that are divorce. He talks about that in the second point about what's the difference in, if you think LGBTQ stuff is sin, and the spouse that cheats on his wife or husband, or the person who steals, or the person who abuses alcohol, etc. Like, these are all valid points.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
what were your thoughts on this video? I thought he did a great job of explaining.
Yeah, and I think kind of, and again, we'll post the link to that like video expert on our within our description. But one of the things I thought was at the very beginning of the video where he mentioned, you have to kind of know what type of church you're going to and what they believe. And I think just that aspect I think is very important because we're actually having a conversation at our we've been at the church I'm working at now, we've been kind of going through this whole like revisioning stage of who we are and what we should be doing. So a lot of meetings, a lot of consultants coming in, a lot of marketing people coming in. So it's been interesting to say the least.
Well,
Um,
how many times have we had that conversation over the last couple of years while we've been doing this podcast together? Like,
mhm.
how many times, do people go to church and they don't necessarily know what you believe?
Yeah,
Like,
and
you could talk about the basic principles of theology and, Christianity, of Jesus dying and raising from the dead and those things and how to be saved. But like, what are your principle, like what are your core beliefs on scripture, on the Holy Spirit, on ordinances of communion?
yeah.
What's your mission statement? What's, like XYZ?
Well,
Go ahead.
yeah, and
Sorry.
even that, like, well, even that, like, there's also something that's interesting because when you think about just just thinking about the LGBTQ community, some of them go to church and they go to these big churches and they're like, "Oh yeah, this is great. It's happening. I'm building a lot of friendships." you get accustomed to the church, you become more active in the church, and then of course naturally you go, hey, I would like to serve in the church. And then when it gets to that point where I want to serve in this church, you then find out from the leadership, oh, I'm sorry, you cannot serve into this church because you're gay, lesbian, a trans man, trans women, and we believe that is sinful and you're not allowed to serve. But yet when you look at their website, when you look at their messaging, when you look at everything, it's always about come as you are. We want you here at our church. And then you go and then you realize, well, we're glad you're here, but you can't be involved. You can't be in leadership. You can't do this. And it kind of takes them aback a little bit like, well, wait a minute. What do you mean I can't? You guys are so nice. You're so open. You're so loving. And then all of a sudden I want to like, because I love Jesus, I want to go and, serve and like, be on the choir or be on the worship team or do all this stuff and then, or even be on the tech team. And you're saying, no, sorry, you can't. So I think that's something, or even if we take the LGBTQ out of the way, and let's say you're a divorced man and you're going to church and you're doing good, and you're like, man, I really want to serve on, I really want to serve on a ministry team or be a greeter. And then you go and you be a greeter and like, oh, well, sorry, you can't greet because, we believe divorce is a sin. And since you're divorced, you can't serve in the church. I mean, it's kind of one of those things where if you're not upfront about what you believe or everything else about certain things, then it becomes really deceptive when you're a church that says we're for everybody. And then you go to the church and you realize that's not entirely true.
And
So
then
it's a
you
bit
can't serve.
and you can't serve. And then it's hard because then you feel like, okay, I've invested my life into this church for a couple years. And now they're not going to let me serve because of I'm divorced or because because I vote because I vote Republican or whatever the case may be. And now you have to go find a new church if you really feel God's calling you to serve. And that's always hard because now it's like, okay, here's this other church that seems good, but are they going to allow me to serve because I am a divorced man or I am a trans woman or whatever the case may be? Like, so I think from the get-go from that video when he's saying you have to kind of know what type of church you are, what type of church you're going to. And I think that's really key because I think a lot of churches are very deceptive with their
Yeah.
marketing, with how they say like, and I think even a lot of ways, just community perception can also kind of tailor that. So that's why it's always important to know. And I think when that guy, starts off by saying, there's some churches who basically say that if you are part of the LGBTQ community, we do not want you here. You're not allowed here and everything else. And he's like, that's not the type of church we are. And then he goes, now there's some churches that say we're affirming, and by affirming basically means that we're taking the side of culture. We're not going to believe in all the scriptures that we read that say that, homosexuality is a sin. We're just going to rip those out because the Bible's wrong about that. And he's even saying, that's what I mean by affirming, and we are not that type of church. So he really, I think so the pastor here really kind of communicated like, we believe the Bible as a whole. We're not taking verses or we're ripping out pages of our Bible because we don't like the message. Like, we believe in what the Bible says, and we think that culture is wrong with stuff. So then we have to come to who we are as a church, and here's what we believe. And he goes on to explain all that. And I thought that was very good, just to kind of let people know this is what we do, this is what we believe. And it seemed like from the video, a lot of people were, cheering, like, yeah, we're not a church that's telling the LGBT community they're not welcome here. We're also not a church that's saying like, you can be who you are and we're not going to care about what the Bible says about homosexuality because we're just going to ignore those verses. Like, we're not that church either. So we're kind of somewhere in between. And here's what we mean. And here's how we interact with people who are from the LGBTQ community. But he also said, like, we are not so much affirming of that as we are affirming of a man who's beating his wife or a man who is drinking or a woman who's doing all this sinful stuff. Like, they're saying if the Bible says that this stuff is wrong or sinful, then that's what we believe. It doesn't matter if you're cisgendered or LGBTQ. Like if you're a straight man, but you are doing coarse joking and cussing and getting drunk with the boys after work, yeah, that's we're not affirming of that either. We're not affirming of that type of lifestyle or behavior. So I think that is very so I think that's very key when it comes to how he described the type of church that they are and how they try to be a biblical church, but also kind of be a little bit more of like, we want people here. We love people because Jesus loved everybody. So I think that was kind of a very good way of him presenting what they believed.
Yeah. Um, I just wish that more pastors and leaders would do what that pastor did. And what I mean by that is just not necessarily like taking a stance one way or the other. I'm trying to be careful what I say. I just think that like there's so many people out there that don't say anything and leave people in a lurch and leave people wondering. So like not saying it's okay to do one thing or the other, but I'm just saying that, you have to be the lead. You have to be the leader of the flock and you have to be the pastor of the church and you have to people need to know what you believe. And that's, I don't understand why we live in this culture now of like why can't we just tell people? Like why can't we leave from the pulpit? Why can't we say, "Hey, we're a house of God that loves everybody. You know, we're not going to be of the world, but we're going to be of the cross and we're going to be of Jesus." And that includes loving people like Jesus did. And yeah, I just don't understand why more pastors don't do that.
Yeah, and I think it's well, and one of the things I also appreciate about the video is he was also saying, we're not someone who's going to be turning off the comments.
Yes.
If there's something that's happening, whether it's controversial or something that's a culturally sensitive issue, and if you disagree with us and you're going to write about it in the comments or you're going to talk to our staff members here at church or whatever, we're going to respond to you. We're going to have a dialogue. And it's going to be cordial, it's going to be peaceful. It's not going to be like we're not going to have security. We're not going to have like our IT people scrub or delete those comments when they come up if we don't like it. We're not going to have security ask you out, or I'm not going to go up on the stage and say, "Hey, you witch, get out of here." Like nothing like that. Like we are going to have a dialogue. We're going to have a conversation, and really, we're going to kind of really it's going to break down, does the Bible define culture or does culture define the scriptures? And I think the way he presented that was very key, very good, but at least there was a transparency too. Hey, if you don't like what we're preaching about, great, let's have a conversation. Let's figure out why you don't like it. Let me figure out why you believe a certain way. I'm going to go break it down to why I believe a certain way. And at the end of the day, if we don't, if we still have our stances at the end of the day, that's okay. We're glad that we had the conversation. We're glad that you're interacting with us as a church, even though it's not like even though it's not necessarily your stereotypical like worship time with the hands in the air singing praise Jesus, but there's a very peaceful dialogue when we have differences.
I wish more churches would actually do that.
I mean, I think so too. And I think, it's, I don't know. I think it's one of those things where I think, I don't even know how to, on why they don't. I really don't, because I feel like if you are, I don't know, maybe because pastors are afraid to do that because maybe they're alienating members of the congregation if they say something that someone in the congregation doesn't like, or maybe it's one of those things where you have a elder board saying, "Hey, you are not going to engage in these type of conversations." So they want to kind of simply ignore it, and maybe that could be just the pastor's perspective, like maybe they don't want to tackle it because they know, like, hey, this is going to be a bit controversial. Maybe some pastors don't want to tackle because you don't want to be the pastor that says, hey, homosexuality is wrong or sinful, and yet you have a transgendered son, you know what I mean, or a lesbian daughter. And so it's like, you're preaching against it, but you also know you're alienating your own family. So maybe you're a little like, I'm not going to talk about it because I'm kind of in it, I don't know. Like, I don't know, Micah. Like, I think sometimes pastors, they need to, if they want to address something, they either need to address it, and they need to do so with grace, because some pastors, they have no issue addressing it, but sometimes they address it in such a way that is very alienating, where it's very aggressive or very mean or very whatever. And even when you call someone out, and even if you're like, hey, pastor, I think you're being a little too rough or too harsh on it, and it's like, well, I don't care what you think. This is what I believe, and this is what I think Scripture believes. And if you don't like it, like, get out of here. Like, I don't know, man. I feel like if pastors were more open to having conversations without the fear of losing their jobs or being reprimanded or losing their credentials or whatever the case may be, I feel like our churches would probably be in a more healthier state.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that it's a shame that we can't have conversations. We can certainly have conversations about political reasons and people who we want to vote for, but we can't have conversations about, same-sex marriage and transgenders this and transgender that, or I don't know what's another good example of a hot button topic these days.
I don't know, like, or worship,
Abortion. Abortion.
abortion or worship.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, oh, I mean, it's 2024 and there's still some churches that are still fighting the worship wars. Like, okay, come on, man. Like, you're fighting a battle that has already been done with. Like,
Turn your hymnals to page 437.
yeah, goodness. All right. Well, friends, let us know what you think. And again, that video, we'll have it in the description so you can kind of follow it. It is a TikTok link, so if you don't have TikTok, I think you can actually watch the video if you click on it through your web browser.
I think that church has a YouTube page too.
They do. I'll kind of investigate, and maybe if they have like a Reels, I might just put a link to that. I know when we did the Bible translation, I was able to add the actual video as a end credit on our podcast, where people could just click on it and go straight to that video. So I'll try to I'll investigate that. And either way, you should be able to see that video, whether it's through YouTube or TikTok. You can kind of access that video to watch it and kind of see how this pastor responded to this topic of discussion. So, friends, thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend, and we'll be back on with another episode. Take care. Thank you for listening to the Scott Stedman Podcast. The Scott Stedman Podcast is made possible by support from our listeners. We thank listeners like Patty and Scott, whose support goes to this podcast's continual growth and maintenance. If you want to support this podcast, you can do so in a number of ways. First, feel free to give us a 5-star rating if you enjoyed this episode and share it with your friends. If you'd like to financially support the Scott Stedman Podcast, you can go to the website ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. That website again is ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.